And as we continue to follow the latest in developments from Northeastern's campus, we took the case to our local experts, and if it was not staged, we asked what the criminal charges for the person who placed that device could be facing. Western Mass News reporter Paris Dunford joins us live with the details. Paris.
Mary, Hampton District Attorney Anthony Gulluni breaks down what criminal charges this person could be facing and the severity of this case.
The city of Boston and really all of Massachusetts is on high alert after the reports of an explosion at Northeastern University's campus. Police there calling it a detonation of a hard black case that was pressurized, but they found no evidence of explosive materials. Springfield Fire Captain Drew Pamonte explains how a device like that could cause an explosion.
Once it's breached, it'll automatically release the pressurized contents. Depending on the quantity of the pressure, the PSI, then that'll determine what the violence of the rupture would be.
However, they say they did find a rambling note that criticized Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg and the relationship between academic institutions and the developers of virtual reality. The suspicious package was delivered to the Northeastern Virtual Reality Lab and injured the employee who opened it. Sources say officials are now investigating the case as a possible hoax and suggest it all could have been staged by the employee. Western Mass News is getting answers as to what criminal charges the person who placed the device could be facing if caught, or what charges the employee could be facing if it's determined to be a hoax. Hampton District Attorney Anthony Gulluni tells us these cases involving detonations are taken very seriously.
Something like the detonation of a bomb or explosive device can result in a slew of charges. We do have specific charges around the detonation of an explosive device, which are felonies and could end up with very long state prison sentences.
He says depending on what the note said, it could be used as evidence to charge the person more, either with a hate crime, a terrorist attack, or even just proving the person's intent.
The federal government has charges that would be very serious around things like terrorism, hate crimes, things of that nature. It would all depend on certain circumstances and what any apparent motivation would be behind the use of a bomb or explosive device.
And if it's determined to have been a hoax, there are serious charges associated with that too. Those include filing a false police report, conspiracy, and more.
And as of right now, no one has been charged in this case, but local, state, and federal police are all assisting in the investigation. We will, of course, bring you the latest developments as they come into our newsroom. Reporting live in studio, Paris Dunford for Western Mass News.